In 1990, global trade was worth $4 trillion. By 2022, it had hit $32 trillion. That's the greatest economic miracle in human history. And right now, it's being dismantled, deliberately. Piece by piece, not by accident, not by a recession, but by choice. The question isn't whether globalization is dying. The question is, who killed it, and what comes next for your money, your job, and the world order you grew up in? Let me take you back to 1991. The Soviet Union just collapsed. Francis Fukuyama is on every television set in America declaring the end of history. Liberal democracy won. Free markets won. The world had one operating system now, capitalism, and everybody was about to plug in. For the economists and policymakers sitting in Washington, London, and Brussels, this was the moment they had been waiting for their entire careers. The theory was elegant, almost beautiful in its simplicity. If every country specializes in what it does best, if Germany makes precision machinery, Bangladesh makes textiles, Saudi Arabia pumps oil, and China makes everything else, then the whole world gets richer. Nobody has an incentive to go to war with their biggest customer. Trade becomes the ultimate peace treaty. And for about 2 decades it worked. China lifted 800 million people out of poverty. That's not a typo. 800 million. The largest reduction in human suffering in recorded history, achieved not through foreign aid or charity, but through being invited into the global supply chain. Apple designed products in California. Taiwan made the chips. South Korea made the screens. China assembled it all. And American consumers got a $1,000 smartphone for $999. It was the golden age of globalization. But here's where I need you to pay attention. Because most people think globalization collapsed because of Donald Trump, or COVID, the war in Ukraine. The reality is much darker, and it started long before any of that. The year is 2000. China joins the World Trade Organization. The champagne is flowing in Geneva. But in Youngstown, Ohio, nobody's celebrating. Economists at MIT, David Otter, David Dorn, and Gordon Hanson, would later study what happened to American manufacturing communities when China entered the global trading system. Their findings were devastating. Between 1990 and 2011, the United States lost 2.4 million manufacturing jobs, directly attributable to Chinese import competition. They called it the China shock. And here's the thing that the free trade textbooks never prepared anyone for. The jobs didn't come back. Classical economics said, don't worry, workers will retrain. They'll move to growing industries. The overall pie is bigger, so everyone wins eventually. But eventually is a brutal word when you're 52 years old, your pension just got cut, your town's only hospital closed, and the factory that employed your father and grandfather is now a parking lot. The political establishment, left and right, looked at the aggregate numbers and said, globalization is working. GDP is up, inflation is low, trade is humming. They were right about the numbers. They were catastrophically wrong about the people. But the Rust Belt was just Act 1 of the unraveling. Because while the West was debating the human cost of free trade, something far more strategic was happening on the other side of the world. China wasn't just plugging into the global system. It was learning how to replace it. When China joined the WTO, the Western assumption was simple. Economic integration would lead to political liberalization. Get rich, build a middle class. The middle class demands rights. Democracy follows. It happened in South Korea. It happened in Taiwan. It would happen in China. That assumption turned out to be one of the most expensive strategic miscalculations in modern history. Instead of liberalizing, China industrialized and then weaponized its position in the global supply chain. Here's how it worked. By 2010, China controlled roughly 97% of the world's rare earth element production. These are the minerals that go into everything. Electric vehicles, fighter jets, smartphones, missile guidance systems. Everything. In 2010, after a diplomatic dispute with Japan, China quietly restricted rare earth exports to Japanese manufacturers. No declaration, no news conference, just a quiet chokehold. Japan's technology sector, one of the most sophisticated in the world, suddenly realized it was hostage to decisions made in Beijing. Washington noticed, but it didn't act. Not yet. Then came the Huawei moment. When the United States started investigating Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant, for intellectual property theft and security backdoors in its 5G infrastructure, they discovered something terrifying. Huawei equipment was embedded in the critical telecommunications networks of dozens of countries, including close American allies. If those backdoors were real, and U.S. intelligence agencies said they were, then Beijing potentially had a listening post inside the infrastructure of half the world. That was the moment the calculus in Washington changed permanently. Globalization wasn't just an economic policy anymore. It was a national security vulnerability. And once that idea took hold, it spread like wildfire across every Western capital. And then 2020 arrived. And if China's rise was the slow-building thunderstorm, COVID-19 was the lightning strike that showed everyone exactly how exposed they were. In February 2020, hospitals across Europe and North America started running out of PPE, personal protective equipment, surgical masks, gloves, gowns, basic stuff, life or death basic stuff. Where was it all made? China. In the panic of the early pandemic, several countries, including China, placed export restrictions on medical equipment. In a global health emergency, the most interconnected trading system in history failed to deliver basic medical supplies to wealthy nations with world-class healthcare systems. Think about how extraordinary that is. The United States, the wealthiest nation in human history, was in bidding wars for surgical masks. Supply chain managers who had spent decades optimizing for efficiency, cutting inventory, relying on just-in-time delivery from overseas factories, suddenly discovered that efficiency and resilience are not the same thing. You can have a perfectly efficient supply chain until the one moment you desperately need it, and then it collapses overnight. The semiconductor crisis that followed was even more illustrative. In 2021, a global chip shortage, triggered by pandemic disruptions, an ice storm in Texas, and a factory fire in Japan, caused General Motors, Ford, and dozens of major automakers to halt production. Not because there was anything wrong with their factories, but because they couldn't get a $5 microchip from Taiwan. A $5 chip shutting down a $40,000 car. And at the center of it all was one company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. TSMC manufactures roughly 90% of the world's most advanced chips. It sits on an island 100 miles from mainland China, an island that Beijing has explicitly and repeatedly said it intends to reunify with the mainland. One invasion, one naval blockade, one serious military incident, and the global economy doesn't just slow down, it stops. This is the moment. Not Trump, not Brexit, not any one politician. This is the moment that Western governments made an irreversible strategic decision. Globalization as it existed was over. The only question was what would replace it. What's happening now isn't random, it isn't chaos. It has a name. Economists call it friendshoring. The idea is simple. Instead of trading with whoever is cheapest, you trade with whoever you trust. You rebuild supply chains not for maximum efficiency, but for maximum security. You accept higher costs as the price of not being held hostage. And the infrastructure of this new world is being built at extraordinary speed. In the United States, the CHIPS and Science Act, signed in 2000, committed $52 billion to rebuild domestic semiconductor manufacturing. Intel, TSMC, and Samsung are now constructing massive fabrication plants on American soil, plants that are more expensive than their Asian equivalents, plants that will take years to reach full capacity. But they're being built. The Inflation Reduction Act poured nearly $400 billion into clean energy manufacturing, specifically designed with provisions that exclude Chinese components. You don't get the tax credit if your battery has Chinese materials. That's not free trade. That's managed trade, and it's deliberate. In Europe, the story is the same. The EU launched its Critical Raw Materials Act, specifically targeting dependence on Chinese minerals. It's building battery gigafactories across Germany, Poland, and Hungary. It slapped tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. Brussels, the cathedral of free trade, is now practicing industrial policy that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. And the factory floors aren't moving back to America or Europe. Not entirely. They're moving to friendly countries. Vietnam's exports to the United States have nearly tripled in 5 years. Mexico is now America's largest trading partner, overtaking China for the first time. India is being courted by every major Western government as an alternative manufacturing hub. This isn't deglobalization, it's reglobalization, but along political fault lines instead of pure economic ones. The world is dividing into 3 rough spheres: a US-led Western bloc centered on the AUKUS Security Pact, the Quad, NATO economic coordination, and G7 supply chain initiatives; a China-led Eastern bloc built on the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS expansion, and bilateral currency agreements designed to reduce dollar dependency; and a massive middle world of non-aligned nations: India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Turkey, the UAE, who are playing both sides brilliantly extracting maximum advantage from each bloc while committing to neither. This is the new architecture of global trade, and it has profound consequences for everyone. Now let's bring this down from the geopolitical stratosphere to something concrete. Because if you're watching this and thinking, okay, this is interesting, but what does it actually mean for my life? Here's your answer. First, prices are going up and they're going to stay higher. Efficiency was deflationary. The whole reason a flat-screen TV got cheaper every year for 20 years is because globalization constantly found the cheapest place to make it. Friendshoring reverses that trend. You build in Ohio instead of Shenzhen, you pay Ohio wages, and that cost gets passed to consumers. Central bankers are starting to call this structural inflation. It doesn't go away when supply chains normalize, because the supply chains are being deliberately restructured. Second, your investment geography matters more than ever. A decade ago, a globally diversified portfolio worked because the global economy was genuinely converging. That convergence is over. Being invested in Chinese tech stocks, Russian energy, or companies with heavy exposure to cross-block supply chains carries a different risk profile than it did in 2015. This isn't about panic. It's about awareness. Third, the energy transition is being fought through trade policy. The race to control clean energy supply chains. Lithium, cobalt, rare earths, solar panels is the great economic competition of the next 30 years. The country that controls those supply chains will have the same leverage that Saudi Arabia had over oil in the 20th century. Governments know this, their trade policy reflects it, and hundreds of billions of dollars in investment flows are being redirected accordingly. And there's something bigger here than just economics. The original promise of globalization was that economic interdependence would make the world more peaceful, that you don't bomb your biggest customer, that mutual prosperity was the highest form of diplomacy. That promise isn't entirely dead, but it's deeply wounded, because what we've learned in the last decade is that interdependence without trust is not peace, it's leverage, and leverage in the hands of an adversary is a weapon. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Globalization didn't fail because it was a bad idea. It failed because it was an incomplete one. It assumed that economic rationality would eventually trump political calculation, that nations would always choose prosperity over power, that the rules-based international order was a destination rather than a choice that had to be made, and remade, every single day. It turned out that some nations were playing a different game entirely, not the game of comparative advantage and mutual prosperity, the game of strategic supremacy. And by the time the architects of the liberal trading order noticed, the chessboard had already been rearranged. What we're living through right now isn't just a trade war. It isn't just geopolitics. It is the reorganization of the entire global economy around a new set of first principles, where security matters as much as efficiency, where geography matters as much as price, where your ally matters more than the lows. The lowest bidder. The old world isn't coming back, but the new one? It's being built right now, in semiconductor fabs in Arizona, in lithium mines in Chile, in ports in Vietnam, in war rooms in Washington, Beijing, and Brussels. And the decisions being made in those rooms will shape the next 50 years of human history. The question is whether you're paying attention. I started this channel for one reason, because the most important things happening in the world, the shifts that actually affect your wealth, your career, your country, are almost never explained in a way that respects your intelligence. You get hot takes. You get partisan spin. You get 30-second clips designed to outrage rather than illuminate. This community is for people who want the real story, the historical context, the structural forces, the connections between a trade deal signed in Geneva in 1994 and a factory that closed in Ohio in 2008 and a chip shortage that idled your car in 2221. Those things are connected. And once you start seeing the connections, you start seeing everything differently. If that's the kind of thinking you want more of, hit subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because the algorithm will bring you back next time I publish. And what I'm covering next connects directly to everything we talked about today. Because there's one country that has positioned itself to win regardless of which bloc comes out on top, and almost nobody in Western media is talking about it. That video is coming next. Don't miss it.